You're watching Talking Audio Engineering with special guest Simon Moro.
How do you get your bottom end tight, and how would you define a tight bottom end in a mix?
I would focus first on getting all the lower elements in tune with the actual key of the song. Sometimes that's a matter of like running the bass guitar through Melodyne or something like that. Ideally, you would have it in tune. The bass player would have played it in tune in the beginning. The kick drum, sometimes you can supplement that with a sine generator, and that would be obviously in the key of the songs. That's where I would start with low end. Do you want to pick up on maybe another way that they could get low end? Tight low end, sorry.
A tight low end in a mix for me is one that feels contained and focused. So uncontained and out of focus, to me, wobbles around the room. So I want the low end to feel like each note is the same volume or an intentional volume because it has to follow the dynamics of the song. When it starts to wobble around the space or lack focus, then we can look at why that's happening. So for me, a tight low end is an intentional low end that is present when you want it to be and absent when you want it to be absent. Would you agree with that as sort of a fundamental?
Yeah, I've never really thought about it in those terms, but what you're saying makes sense.
If one resonance in the low end pokes out and the next one disappears, I would say that's not tight.
Yeah.
Unless it's intentional, and when you're in that sub space, because again, I'm thinking this is like 80 hertz and below, where you're feeling it more than hearing it. So it's that, well, I guess it's like the perception of gravity. When the bass is present, we feel heavy, and when it's absent, we feel light. So if it's unintentionally fluctuating in and out of energy, then it can affect your perception of gravity in an unintentional way. So unlike using, the absence of a bass note to make people jump up and the presence of a bass note to make people move down, that's how you hit a groove. Dom, ba-boom. So people are going to want to be down when the note's present and upward. So I think any sort of unintentional fluctuations of that low end energy would be described as bass that is not tight. First of all, it has to be present in the performance. If it's an electric bass and it's being played and it's not set up right, or the playing is inconsistent, there's going to be problems there. You can also check the instrument to make sure that the low end is equally present in the signal, because again, the note might be fine or the transient might be the same level, but the low end is just not being picked up. It can also be the voicing. So if you're playing a bass part, and let's say on a 4-string bass, your low E is, unless you down tune it, is going to be your lowest note. So if you're playing a song where the chorus is in E, or the downbeat of chorus 1 is an E major chord, and playing through the verse, you're going up and up and up the neck, and then you hit the downbeat on the E up the octave, you're going to have this thin, much less deep downbeat of the chorus when it should be getting bigger. So, I would say make sure that you could go up the neck, but just go back down and hit the tonic with the low E on the one of the chorus. So it has to be present in the performance, has to be consistent in the performance, it has to be in tune, particularly if you have other instruments in that space and there's a risk of masking. So that's where you might want to decide, do you want the low energy of the kick drum to be the dominant force down there, or do you want the resonance in the bass to be the dominant energy there? Because if you want the low end of the bass to be dominant there, then maybe you're not ducking the bass with the kick, rather than, sort of pushing the kick drum, smushing it into the bass. You're going to have the bass wrapping around the kick. That's a decision to make. And then, you might just be not having as much low end in the kick and getting the click and the attack from the kick and just having the bass play at the same time, and you're still going to get that low end in there. But it's a different approach. So yeah, consistency in performance good arrangement, make sure the notes are there. Presuming that's all done, then I'm looking at a spectrum analyzer, and that will show you if there are dramatic differences between, note to note, bar to bar, your low end energy. So if it is if there's an unusual peak or trough, it's getting to the root cause of why that's happening. You can solo and see what's happening, but again, you still have to be careful with your monitoring, because there's that balance between, technical energy and psychoacoustic perception of something. I think, we've probably all experienced, looking at a clip, and the quiet part of the clip is actually louder than the preceding part that's twice the dynamics. Well, why is that? So you've got to factor that in as well. But a spectrum analyzer is immune to your monitors and your room's inherent flaws.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that they can play a part, looking for any oddness there. If you are seeing unusual changes in low end energy, and it's not present when you're soloing and it's only there when it's all together, then I'd start thinking about masking. So if you have piano, bass, and kick drum, there could be a lot of frequencies below 80 hertz that are all fighting for the same space. And it's that masking that, to me, leads to a lack of focus. Because we know that with masking, if there's multiple sound sources with the same frequency, the loudest of those sources will be the one that our ears hear, but those lower volume ones still affect it. So that's where I would be looking to pull that out of the other instruments. So let's say we're going for, bass, kick, piano, and I want the weight to be from the bass guitar. Then I'd probably start with a high pass filter on the piano. How far up can I turn that with everything in? Doing this not in solo. How far up can I turn that before I notice, an issue? What I want to hear is that, hang on, now the bass is sounding twice as big, even though all I did was take the low end out of the piano. So that will help with the focus.
That's a good point, actually, right there about masking and actually filtering out stuff on other instruments while you're listening to the thing that you actually want to affect.
Yeah. So solo doesn't matter. I rarely EQ in solo because that's not the context that the EQ matters. So this might mean that I'm duplicating the piano so that maybe in the first verse where there's no bass, or the first couple of bars of the intro where the bass isn't present and the piano's driving, I might just have two tracks, one where the piano has the low end in it, one where the piano has the low end removed. And, that will just save me having to automate filters. I get an instant visual identification just looking at the edit page. There's my filter piano, there's my full bandwidth piano. The other thing I might do, if it's more complicated than that, I might then duck the low frequencies out of the piano with a dynamic EQ or something like that. So a few different ways to deal with masking.
I feel like for me that's the best way to do it, because it means I don't have to start multing out the tracks and making multiple copies of it. And
because I'm often treating instruments differently from section to section, if I have piano, I'm at the very least going to have two different versions of it in my mix. And it means I can saturate them differently, EQ them differently, different levels of reverb, compression, whatever. So yeah, but if I was having to have five tracks of the same piano with different levels of filtering, and I could achieve the same result with a dynamic EQ sidechain with the bass or whatever.
You tend to be relying more on multing things out, duplicating tracks and treating them differently.
They achieve different results. If I'm happy with a static piano sound with the low end carved out of it on its own track, I would rather see that, because then I'm going, oh, that's right, that's the verse piano, and you know what, I've got a little bit of like grit on it or some other character. If it's maybe say a jazz record, then I'd be more inclined to go with the dynamic EQ.
Okay, that's interesting.
I might not want the low end to come back in between the bass notes. So it really depends. So presuming we've covered masking and issues with performance and source material and tuning, etc., then I would look at things like with the bass, I very often split lows and highs, or lows and sort of neck. And my crossover might be somewhere, depends on the song, but usually 120 below will go to my low bass and above that will go to my high bass.
You're splitting that how? Using multiband or literally filtering it out?
Most of the time, I'll use FabFilter Q3 and I just do a low pass and a high pass.
Okay.
And I send from the bass to the low bass bus and the high bass bus. So I send the bass track to multiple outputs.
You adjust that crossover between those two.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll leave a gap. I don't like 120 hertz. So often I might send 110 down and 140 up and just leave a gap there rather than EQ it out. It depends on the song. The other thing is in my setup, the high bass, I send out my B bus with drums, bass, percussion, and any sort of drum loops. Whereas the lows, I send straight to the 2 mix. So that's not going through the B bus compression. Again, I want less of this and more even low end. So that lets me control the lows and the highs separately. I will sometimes put a multiband compressor on those lows just to really compress them and reduce that dynamic range to give it more evenness.
More consistency, yeah.
And I'll sometimes send that to a sub-synth generator if I want some analog sub.
Have you tried low air or R bass? I find those two really good.
R bass, max bass, and low air, excellent. Yeah, they're really good. Yeah, sometimes they can be, low air particularly can be quite risky if you go a little bit too much with it. I'm actually using max bass more, and I'll often use max bass with the high bass and let a little bit more of the lows in, maybe down to 110, and then use max bass to get a little bit more of the note resonance out.
Okay. I thought max bass was adding upper harmonic content.
It does.
So that
it does. Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm using it on the higher one to get sort of in that low mid range.
Vitamin is another one that would do something similar to that. It's based on max bass.
That's Waves Vitamin, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't want to make this a Waves commercial, but I've got a lot of their stuff.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
Yeah. I've never bought it on sale though. I don't know. They never seem to have any sales.
That's true. If only they did,
I know.
Yeah. So with all of that addressed, then we're probably getting to one of the other problems with low end, and that is monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
The difficulty with bass is the source and the monitoring. All the stuff that we talked about, techniques with masking, splitting things.
They mean nothing unless you've got those two things.
Exactly. Getting that super tight low end is really performance, arrangement, orchestration, choice of sounds, and then the room you're listening in. You and I were talking earlier and having a bit of a joke, about, when we figure this out, we'll definitely tell people, but I still want my bass to be tighter. And sometimes I feel like, yeah, I really, really nailed that. That's great. But then other times I feel like I'm fighting it, but it is different to what it used to be. It used to be, I have no idea how to wrangle this low end energy. And now I know how to do that and I can monitor it well. I just want to take it up to this next level, because so I'm into cycling, as you know, and cycling can be really hard. And that's one of the enjoyable things about it. I often say, it's something that you enjoy after you've finished it, as the sense of achievement. You know, I climbed 1,500 meters, or I rode 100 Ks, and you know, it was painful while I was doing it, but now I had this wonderful achievement today, and the rest of the day, you know, and I feel like it can be a little bit like, to finish that thread, with cycling, they say it never gets easier, you just go faster. So you're always pushing the same effort, the same pain, but as you get stronger, you're just going faster. And I feel like a similar thing applies to bass. You just want to get better at it. So it's always going to be a challenge to some level, because once you're like, wow, I've achieved that goal of controlling the bass. Now I want to take it to the next level. I've done that. Now I want to take it to the next level. So I think bass can be a little bit like that. Monitoring in room is fundamental to this.
Well, my solution to that really is working in isotopes tone balance control throughout the entire mix. So within that, you've got the ability to monitor the crest factor in the low end. Basically, the crest factor, if the little thing goes over to the left-hand side, then it means that transient information from your kick drum or just any transient information is too hot. And so it's like a what are they called? Like a leveler, where you got that little bubble that moves around.
Spirit level.
And so spirit level, and you're trying to keep that bubble in the middle, and that's the balance between transient content and sustained content. And I've actually since got my head around it, and I can move it wherever I want. And that's been great, because it means that it's just a matter of pushing up the bass a little bit more, or figuring out how to get more sustain from that so that it's more within a typical range of what's being released.
So is that also affecting the sound, or is it a monitoring tool for you?
Literally just a meter. Yeah.
That's great. So that's isotope.
Tone balance control, tonal balance control.
Tonal balance control. And it does no processing, just metering. That's great.
No.
Okay, I want to check that out. So yeah, your room and your monitors, and they're both a challenge. I would say that it's probably easier to improve your room than your monitors. You know, if you have, I would say you probably have to spend 15 to 30 grand to get some serious monitors. If you're spending 3 grand on monitors, you're probably not going to get much better result until you're definitely over 10 grand.
I've got a few kidneys.
You do, but they're not yours, and they're for investment for
pool techs.
Yeah, exactly.
Those pool techs we're looking at.
Yeah. So given that, you know, 10K plus on monitors might not be possible, I would start by looking at what improvements can be done in the room. And, you know, the difference between prefabricated acoustic treatment solutions and rolling your own. The reality is it's probably going to cost a couple of grand. And for that sort of money, you could get good results. I think the prefabricated diffusers can be quite good value. The prefabricated bass traps, any of those foam ones are pretty much a waste of time. But making your own out of good high density insulation and then just wrapping them in fabric, that's going to be the best result. And you can get, you know, for $600 or so, definitely under a grand, you'd get enough of that to treat a decent sized room.
Yeah, I need to treat the back of mine.
Yeah, so I would start with the low end. And, you know, the room I'm in now, which I built into my garage, I had the delight of listening to it with nothing in it, and then with the bass treatment when I moved it in. And I should say that there is bass treatment built into the structure. With the walls, I have bass traps actually built into the walls with exposed insulation on opposite sides of the wall. And the way we designed it is that sound will go through the wall, through the insulation, bounce off, then back through the insulation, then back into the room. Hopefully less so. And then in the room, I've then got, super chunk bass traps and other treatment around the space. And as soon as I put in that heavy density insulation, the bass just got tight because it wasn't bouncing around the room in this uncontained, wobbly way.
And you're doing floor to ceiling, aren't you?
Floor to ceiling. There's a gap where my monitors are, but it's also behind my monitors. So that's a pretty cost-effective way to tighten up the low end in your room. Another way is with headphones, where the room's not going to affect it, but it's very different. When I think of tight low end, it's about a tight low end through speakers in a room. That's the challenge. So getting onto the room, finding ways to, DIY. Someone might be selling something secondhand, which, could be good value. I'm looking at the Dirac room correction software that you put me onto. It's been a technical issue getting it to work, so I've got to send them a diagnostic file or something. So I'm curious to see what other improvements I can make to my room. And there are people that hate any kind of DSP-based room correction. I'm a fan of anything that works. I think SonarWorks is great for headphones. Do I use it? Occasionally. Not all the time, but because my room's good, I'm happy to just use my room and I know my headphones. But I have used it and will use it again. Great tool. I used Multimedia Arc for a couple of years before I upgraded my monitoring in my room. People hated it. I got really good results. It solved a problem for me. My mixers started translating better.
Especially when you're starting out, you don't have that ear training to try and to figure where the holes are.
Well, a way that you can check your room without without using correction software or analysis tools is just to find a good frequency sweep. Every time it sounds like a car shifting gears, that's a problem. So whenever it, they're all nulls and peaks. So if it is all over the place, then you know that your room has some serious problems and it's always going to be a fight.
I think we pretty much covered those points.
Can I add one thing to it? For anyone that is serious about upskilling and developing skills, you can always hire a commercial studio and consider it an investment in education. So find a top tier studio, not a project studio that will be very similar to your home studio with more gear. Go to a proper, in Melbourne, there's not many options these days, but find one and you might need to hire it for 3 days over time to get used to the room, but just try doing a mix in a room where the monitoring's great and the room's good and see if it was easier.
What are your thoughts on getting the bass more mono below a certain frequency, like say 200 hertz, as a means of making sure that it's solid? Because I find that's what really gets it solid, because the correlation meters, if anything's going to get your mix feeling tight, it's having both speakers firing the same information below a certain frequency.
In my session, I have 3 bass channels: low bass, high bass, stereo bass. My low and high bass are mono. I also very often use mid-side EQ on my mix bus and filter lows out of the sides. I don't always do that, but I do it often. So absolutely, that is a great technique, and it's my 95% of the time go-to strategy for low end.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons for the mono low end is because the lower frequencies get, the more omnidirectional they become. The higher frequencies get, They become unidirectional. So given that low end goes out in all directions, there's less of a case to have it stereo. Whereas high frequencies, having it stereo can make sense because you'll really hear the direction of the flute coming from the left speaker or the guitar solo coming from the right speaker. With the low end, our ears struggle to pick up direction because it literally goes in every direction. So that's one of the fundamental reasons why monoing the low end makes sense, because it goes off in every direction anyway. And as you said, it gets the speakers firing together. Now, the reason why I have a stereo-based channel is because in electronic music, sometimes part of the sound is a wide bass. By default, my stereo-based channel does roll off the low end, and I will still send that to the low bass and split that out and make it mono. Sometimes I found I just lost the feel when I monoed, if I'm not producing it, someone else is producing and I'm mixing, I found that I just lost the vibe when I monoed the bass. But 95% of the time, yes, mono the low end.
Another trick is something I picked up somewhere else. I'm not sure where, but I was having an absolutely marvelous day. And they said that most people will pick up the DI track and take that for the top end information. I don't do that. I will roll off the DI because it's the cleanest. It's the cleanest the bass will ever be. We're talking about bass guitar here. So I will put that in the low end, and provided I've got an amp track or I can make an amp track from the DI, can add that to give the character on top of that. That's how I try and get the bass a lot tighter. And of course, you can just tune the DI. You can just tune the DI, and everything else above that can be whatever it will be because it's stereo. And yeah, it's not as critical.
I rarely record bass amps. So
You're right.
Most of the time it's DI. And when people give me DI and bass, I'm absolutely using the DI for the low end. But most of the time, I'm using the DI and muting the amp. And that's because the low end has so much energy. For me to fit it into a mix, having the option to just play through different amps and different speakers till all of a sudden it just gels, gives me the right amount of presence and the right amount of solid low end.
What are some of your favorite amplifiers for bass in the plug-in world?
I like the plug-in Alliance ones. And I like that you can hit the button and it just sort of goes through the different cabinets.
Yeah.
You set how many bars you want it to play before changing. That's generally where I start. Avid 11 has a couple of good bass amps that I like. And I'll occasionally use Waves guitar. They've got some all right bass amps there. But that would be my order. Plug-in Alliance, Avid 11, and then Waves guitar. What about you?
So I use the bass amp preset on the free Plug-in Alliance amplifier quite a lot. And the other one that I use is SansAmp.
Oh yeah, cool.
Then of course there's plenty of other options, such as is that someone cutting grass?
Have you got a neighbor?
That is.
RX has a preset for that, surely.
Yeah.
It's either that or one of your kids has just got fed up. Is it cutting the place down?
With a chainsaw. So, yeah, I mean, the other options are black box, HG-2 or whatever it's called. Anything distortion-wise that you can change the color of in one way or another. Use that to affect the top end. Throw it on a DI track, see what it does. Maybe stack it a few times. I don't know. There's no wrong answer. There's what sounds good for the material, and that's it.
That should be our answer to everything. There's no wrong answer.
It depends, but there's no wrong
but
answer.
here's the right one.
The answer to everything from just about every forum, it depends. From
Yeah,
every single engineer.
and it should be.
And it should be, yeah.
Like it really should be. Yeah.